Hey everyone, LioConvoy here. I want to eventually do an entire retrospective on the original ThunderCats cartoon, talking about its development, going into the concept, then the scripts, then the animation. But before I fully get into that, I wanted to ask people if they had any questions about the original or 2011 ThunderCats, whether it be the lore, production, toys, comics, or whatever have you. Special thanks to Retroblasting for also polling their much bigger audience to get some questions. We're at around 40 questions at the time of this video's release, so I'll have to break this into two parts. So if you ask the question on the Reddit page, in the ThunderCats Wiki Discord server, or the Facebook page for Retroblasting, then you'll get your answers in this video, as long as it was submitted before, well, this recording. For anyone that has questions located on Retroblasting's community tab, I'll get those in part 2, meaning you still have time to ask more questions if you want to. On to the questions. Steve008 asks, loving the idea, thanks dude, I'm not sure you'll be able to answer my questions, but I wonder if there might be some kind of coffee table style book for ThunderCats in the same way there are for Motu, Multiple, and other shows of that era. I know there currently isn't, but do you know of one in production, or could we make one if not? Unfortunately, Steve, the only ThunderCats related book that fits that description is Hear the Roar, an unofficial book, meaning not sanctioned by Warner Brothers, that goes in depth with the creation and production of the show. There is no other book out there for ThunderCats that you described. As far as making one goes, it's doable, but likely difficult due to the scarcity of the original creators that are still around, and the fact that ThunderCats never got as big as Motu or Transformers. Tingle asks, did the deplorable ThunderCats Roar and its failure mean that the industry will now take a step back from ThunderCats and determine no one wants to watch ThunderCats, or will they go beyond this data and determine that the original fanbase wasn't happy with this iteration and instead want a true ThunderCats successor or reboot? Why is Super 7 taking pre-orders for Series 3 figures when they haven't shipped Series 1 figures? Why are no streaming services showing either of the first two versions of the show? Concerning Roar, more likely the former assumption, simply because corporations don't tend to think all that creatively. They think in terms of money influx. Finding out where they went wrong is rare from what I've seen. Have to say though, no one here knows if Roar has failed or not. Super 7 is still taking pre-orders because people are still willing to give them money for it. It's that simple. We're sitting almost a year from the announcement of the first wave and no one's gotten anything yet. The first wave was initially supposed to ship in April. While some may primarily blame the current pandemic on the tardiness, if you speak to any Motu fan that collected the Super 7 line, you'll find this is normal for them. Word has it the first wave is on the boat heading this way though. As far as streaming services go, I think Amazon Prime had the original for a while and Verb had the 2011 version, but the lack of it on streaming services currently may be due to the absurd amount WB charges for the license. Speaking to some people that had looked into it, they want an amount that is kinda silly, so that may be a reason. Epic 2007 asks, why is it that current merchandising based on the classic ThunderCats series, like Super 7's upcoming ThunderCats Ultimates line, refuses to reference the show's model sheets and production cells? Based on the info I got from some of the people that made the Funko Savage World figures, as well as disclaimers on other items stating pending approval, it seems to me these companies are forced to work with whatever Warner Brothers gives them. We saw this in the references given to Freddie Williams that had him drawing the wrong Ancient Spirits of Evil for the Motu crossover, and Funko using the wrong card art for Slythe and Mumra, as well as the wrong ThunderCat symbol for the toys. The best response to this is to just be vocal about the problems until Warner Brothers starts letting people go outside of them for what they need. 10-ounce Can asks, Mumra is ever living. The ThunderCats will age and eventually die, so why doesn't Mumra just sleep for a long time, then wake up to get rid of the ThunderCats? Why can the Eye of Thundera only be used for good? Didn't it used to belong to Mumra or something like that? The guy who originally created the ThunderCats, did he do anything else after that? Was the original concept of who the ThunderCats were supposed to be actually represented in the 80s show, or did they change a lot of it for kids and TV? Did he change the lore, or just the characters? I know of the ThunderCats He-Man, ThunderCats Superman crossover comics. Were there any others? Mumra, while ever living, has major flaws that most evil people do. A lack of patience and a massive ego. Mumra takes issue with the ThunderCats challenging his dominion on Third Earth, so he acts based on that. And while Mumra is ever living, there's also species propagation you have to keep in mind. Mumra will outlive Lion-O, but he might have Lion-O's great-grandson to contend with after he awakens. One that's been given centuries of knowledge and would likely be prepared for Mumra's eventual return. The Eye of Thundera in the original series can only be used for good because its entire purpose is to fight evil. While there have been a couple of stories between the comics for the origins of the Sword of Omens, the Eye of Thundera for the original series hasn't been given a definitive one outside of some text in one of the annuals for the UK comics. As far as the eye originally belonging to Mum-Ra, you seem to be mixing the original up with the 2011 series. Mum-Ra claims the eye belonged to him, but he never actually possessed it. It was stolen from another planet by Tygus, then taken by Leo to rebel against Mum-Ra. While in the original series, the Eye of Thundera had a mystical nature and an absurd amount of power, the 2011 series makes it more akin to a technological power source. Concerning the original creator, if you meant the concept creator, Ted Wolfe, I believe he was already retired when he came up with the basic concept of ThunderCats. He was primarily an inventor. If you're referring to Leonard Starr, he worked on the comic strip Little Orphan Annie until he retired in 2000, then in 2006, started doing covers for reprints of On Stage. When it comes to concept versus final product, to my knowledge, Ted Wolfe didn't have much other than the initial concept of cat people. The show itself was specifically made for kids, and the person that did the lore, characters, and conceptualization of it was Leonard Starr, within a week if I remember correctly. The ThunderCats crossovers are as follows: Battle of the Planets ThunderCats version 1, Battle of the Planets ThunderCats version 2, ThunderCats Superman, and ThunderCats vs. Motu. Of all of them, I find the Battle of the Planets crossover to be the best. Tenouts also asks, when the Lunatics showed up in Season 2, they had a bunch of slaves, and for a few episodes it was a plot point that the ThunderCats were really trying to free them, but then they simply didn't. The story moved on, and we never heard about the slaves of Skytomb in the 1980s cartoon series again. Were they freed in a comic, or a novel, or some other form of media? I would imagine it could either be inferred that the slaves were freed as the ThunderCats left, or that it's just a production oversight. There's a lot that went into that 5-part special, so some holes are to be expected. Especially considering this was when Leonard Starr was showing how unhappy he was at the time working with Rankin Boss, and it shows through his work at this point. Devilman Ozzy asks, I mostly have questions about the origins and concepts for the 1985 series, like why did the mutants use medieval weapons and the cats use Asian region weapons, why they went with the mutants as the main enemies of the 1985 series, is the 1985 version Mum-Ra human or a mutant? Honestly, as someone who studied weaponry of this type, the only ThunderCat that uses an Asian-specific weapon is Panthro, as he uses Nunchaku. Tiger's weapon as it is doesn't seem to exist at all. The bolo aspect of his weapon comes from the South American snare, called a bola, and the whip has existed since ancient Egypt. Chitara's staff isn't just an Asian weapon either. Bow staffs, or staffs in general, have been used everywhere from the Shaolin Monastery in China to man-at-arms in European medieval armies, generally operating in similar ways. Lion-O uses what is distinctly a longsword, a weapon primarily used by the Germans and the Italians. As far as the mutants go, Slithe uses an axe, which is a weapon multiple cultures have used. Jackalman's club is the same, as there are even Japanese clubs like the Kanabo. Monkian alone primarily uses a European set of weapons, a stylized buckler and a flail, and while Rotaro's weapons are supposed to be sized, they look much more like Chris daggers. I'd imagine they went with the mutants as enemies due to the ThunderCats being based on big cats, so using animals to compete with them in reality as foes makes sense, and Mum-Ra in the original series is absolutely a reanimated human. This is confirmed in both the Wildstorm comics that acted as an extended canon for the show, and the 80s comics showing Mum-Ra's backstory as an Egyptian ruler of First Earth. Bernard Michael Duggan asks, who now owns ThunderCats? Anything new on the horizon? Warner Brothers, and other than some statues and figures, nothing new that I've heard of. Daniel E. Corti asks, I heard the animation art style had a connection to the Devilman animated series in Japan. If true, can you elaborate on that? It's possible that Pacific Animation Corporation either had artists that worked on Devilman or outsourced some of the animation to a studio that worked on it. I think this rumor may have originated via this Twitter post by Pella Creepy pointing out some character similarities. Robert Jason Pichota asks, my question, why on earth did LJN make the figures so darn big? With the exception of Bravestar, ThunderCats were the biggest action figures on store shelves. LJN seemed to be somewhat obsessed with innovation over function, so instead of following the lead other toy companies did, they just did their own thing. Whether or not that's a good thing or not is up to your personal opinion. I personally don't need my action figures to be able to reasonably interact with figures of another line. And say what you will about their size, but if you stick Snowman in a sock, you have a solid weapon. Ryan Zaplinski asks, I just want to know who okayed the production of ThunderCats Roar. Warner Brothers. Andrew Von Berlin asks, did the series end where it was meant to end? And if not, what could we have seen as the series and subsequent toys progressed? The thing about cartoon production is you rarely know when your show is going to end. No one had a clue that Book of Omens would be the last episode until they were in the production of it. There's not much out there about plans for a follow-up season, but the fact that the whole series ended on that episode instead of a cliffhanger was a blessing. As far as toys go, there are promotional images and prototypes of another line that was coming, including things like the Thunderstrike and some of the Lunatics. Cole Weston asks, I look forward to the Leonard Starr versus Ted Wolfe in full effect. Would love to hear how Ted got to take the credit and how the fandom became aware that Starr was the creator of almost everything. The sad thing is, I'm pretty sure most of the fandom isn't aware of how much Starr put into this series. I will be doing a full video detailing Leonard Starr and what happened with ThunderCats. If any of you know who Bill Finger is, let's just say Rankin-Boss, specifically Jules Boss, treated Starr in the same way Bob Kane and DC treated Bill Finger. But that topic deserves and will get its own separate video. Nathan Kachasak asks, I really like what they did in the comics with the crossovers of Masters of the Multiverse. Tim Seeley and Dan Fraga really paid homage to all the iterations of the property. Are there any plans for something similar with the ThunderCats? Minus Roar, of course. I'm going to disagree with your opinion on Seeley's writing. I find it to be poor and that he really doesn't understand Motu properly, and the multiverse story was basically a poor ripoff of Shattered Grid. For now, there's nothing like it in plans for ThunderCats. Thank God. Rudy Zissou asks, is there a particular episode from either season that struck a chord with you? The Song of the Pedalars did for myself. Seeing that as an adult was probably more poignant than perhaps viewing it as a child, and I wonder who Hatanzo the Drifter may have been inspired by. Many thanks Retroblasting and LioConvoy. The Ghost Warrior, Sword in the Hole, The Thunder Cutter, and Book of Omens are just a handful of my favorite episodes of the original. When it comes to Hatanzo, I actually chatted with Dan Norton about this in 2011. I assumed he was based on the rabbit samurai Miyamoto Usagi from Usagi Yojimbo. Dan stated that he was aware of that character, but Hatanzo was originally supposed to be a field mouse. His design based on irony. His name, however, is an homage to Hattori Hanzo, a samurai from the 1500s that was credited with saving the life of Tokugawa Ieyasu. Dino Monzon asks, I've got several. Who decided on character names? Why was it decided to base the ThunderCats on Third Earth, when there was an episode where Mumra disguised himself as King Arthur and got Excalibur? And were there concepts for new members that didn't make the cut? And why was Snarf added to the series? Leonard Starr was the one primarily involved with the names, and Third Earth is supposed to be our Earth post-apocalypse. Jim Meskimen made a lot of secondary characters that didn't make the cut, as seen here.
So one day, I created a duck-billed samurai who was this really mean-looking Japanese imperial warrior with this big duck bill on him. That never made it in the show.
Snarf was added to give more levity to the series. Jason Keith Parker asks, the toys seem to be hard to find compared to other lines, and when I did find them, they seem to be priced higher than they should. Did others have this experience, and if so, was there a reason for it? I was a literal child when they came out, so I'm not sure on that aspect. I'll have to leave that answer to the comments section. Jeremy Von Passen asks, how did they come to the decision to have a Japanese studio do the animation? Was it due to previous projects by Rankin-Boss being produced in Japan? Was there a recognition that Japanese animation is very kinetic, cinematic, and of high quality? I personally think it's a bit of both. Rankin-Boss worked with a studio that became Pacific Animation Corporation on all their traditionally animated projects. Jeff Goodridge asks, the building of the mythology is really incredible with the time traveler episodes and whatnot. Was there any more plans to explore the backstory and more about Thundera than the newer series did? I couldn't watch the new series based on its animation. I just couldn't get into it. If there was, it would be contained within the series Bible proper, an item I only know belongs to two people. I've never been able to get my hands on one. It's a grail item for me. Daniel Doherty asks, if I were to ever collect the LJN line, what are the core figures I should prioritize, good guys and bad guys? I'd personally go with the core ThunderCats, the core mutants, and Mumra. Roger J. Burton asks, I have one, and it might have been asked or wanting to be asked, how did Rankin-Boss get away with having the main characters appear nude in the first episode? This is a common possible misconception. The characters aren't actually nude, I believe. This is evident by not just the lack of bits, but also defining lines around their legs, their boots, and belts. I'm guessing these are either bodysuits or even just trunks. Terry Stair asks, what went into casting of the voice actors? Was it anything out of the ordinary, or was it let's just pick out of the voice stock we have? Was any character harder than others to cast? Apparently a lot of thought went into the voice cast, not just in terms of budget, but they were also looking for specific voice types. While some of them are stretched to the extreme due to the small cast, even Earl Hyman at one point told Larry Kinney this was the highest paying job he ever had at the time, and he was a classically trained Othellan actor. As far as hard to cast, one would think Mumra, but Earl Hammond knocked that right out of the park. Michael Berlin asks, I still wonder what would happen if Lion-O kept saying thunder, how long would the sword get? Despite Robot Chicken saying otherwise, we have no idea. The sword's length can be whatever's needed without any sort of voice command. And that's 20 questions down, some really good ones at that. Join me next time for the second part. Heck, if you send more to Retroblasting's community post linked in the description, then we might have a part 3. Special thanks as always to my patrons. If you want to support me or my work, the link for that's in the description. If you liked this video or just want to argue about how wrong I am, feel free to comment. That's all for now. Take care.